What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients so you can brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, friend of the pod, return guest, theologian extraordinaire Joerg Rieger. That's right. Is it that Joerg Rieger, you say? It is indeed. He is the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies and Distinguished Professor of Theology at the Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. That's right, and he is here, and we are talking about his book, Jesus versus Caesar, for people tired of serving the wrong God. Now, we have a good old time talking about Jesus versus Caesar. And this is a good time for you to listen to it because guess what? We are having a book panel about this book as part of the Christ Among the Disciplines conference. And that all you have to do is go to ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com. And you too can sign up and interact with a whole host of different academics, all engaging questions around Jesus and such. It is going to be an amazing conference. ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com. Some of my fellow faculty members, like Matthew Novitzon, about his new book, The Grammar of Messianism. Joshua Ralston, here from the University of Edinburgh, is going to be on another one of the panels. The good doctor, Daniel Kirk. Scott Paith is going to be on. N.T. Wright's going to be a part of it. So it's going to be a tons of fun. There's a whole session on Catherine Tanner's Christ the Key. Remember the interview about that book years back? Ian McFarland, who's been on the podcast, has a book on his a panel on his book. But we're going to be having one on Joerg Rieger's Jesus versus Caesar. And guess who's joining me on that panel? Grace G. Sun Kim. Boom. That's what I'm talking about. A friend of the podcast, Cynthia Rigby, is going to be participating, Fleming Routledge. And then there is a panel on my book, Divine Self-Investment, where Jeffrey C. Pugh, Jacob Erickson, Tom Ord, and the one and only Donna Bowman are all participating. Go to ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com. You can sign up. You can join them live over the course of the end of November. Or if you sign up, you always get access to the videos and audio and such from the conference. So, yeah. It's going to be amazing. Also, I'll link to it on the post for this podcast. Before we jump into the interview, I just want to say, guess what? I mean, we've been doing this podcast for a long time, but we are getting very near crossing 15 million downloads, which is a lot of theology interviews. So if you have ideas of something cool we should do for that milestone, holler back. All right? And remember, you can always support the podcast. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Those people just clapped for it. Anyway, if you join the community, you not only get invited to our private Facebook group, you get the members-only podcast feed, which has tons and tons of extra goodies and classes and lectures and exciting things like that. So, yeah. But you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Because right now, what I need you to do is just to get that earpiece ready because it's Joerg Rieger.
Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Joerg Rieger, and he has a brand new book that you need to go ahead and get for your library, Jesus versus Caesar, for people tired of serving the wrong God. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Trip. It's always good to be with you. How are you?
Well, I'm excited to get to talk to you about this book. We had set up to do this, and then I found out I'm going to be responding to the book in a big online conference coming up, the Christology Across the Disciplines.
Right. I think that's going to be in November, and I look forward to hearing your response.
For anyone that doesn't know about it, I'll link to it on the page with this episode, so you can click over. It's an online conference, and there's a whole bunch of different books from all sorts of different schools of thought. But there's one whole session on your book. There's one on my new book, Divine Self-Investment, and it's gonna be an exciting time on the internet.
Looking forward to it, and congratulations on your book as well.
Oh, well, thanks. Now you've spent quite a bit of time in different texts looking at the relationship of religion and power, and in this specific text, it centers on the Jesus and has Caesar function, right, as a symbol for the question of power and religion. Why do you think the church has such a big problem with power?
That is a great question. I often say if you want to study theology, you really have to study power. You have to pay attention to how power flows. The Jesus story is all about power. It's just that the church is not paying attention, I think. So it's a weird thing, in a way. They're falling into all the possible traps that you can fall in, get power wrong, so to speak. But sometimes, maybe many times, it's unintentional. The church doesn't even know what's happening. And therefore, the real problem with the church is it becomes part of the dominant status quo. It worships the powers that everybody else worships, in a political system, in an economic system. And as it does that, this is that tongue-in-cheek subtitle for people tired of serving the wrong God. It starts serving all the wrong gods it possibly can.
Yeah, at the beginning of the book, you describe it as this fundamental tension at the heart of religion is whether or not it's going to be life-giving for all or not. And while, yes, I think that tension is right there, you also kind of, like, when you state it, go, well, why wouldn't you want to be life-giving for all? Right? Like, no one, if you ask to pick, is going to say, oh, yeah, I want to be life-giving for just a few. Right. So how do you, what kind of critique to kind of the normal self-religious reflection that takes place do we need to cultivate to not just ask the question and, flippantly say, yeah, life-giving for all, but to really interrogate our commitments or habits or patterns or maybe blindness or concealment of this type of perverse power that limits the horizon of blessing?
So I think this is really the phenomenon that I found, life-giving on the one hand and death-dealing on the other hand. And I think you're right. Nobody in their right mind would want to be death-dealing. Of course, there are some people out there like that, that like killing and doing all these horrible things to people. That's perversion. But by and large, I think people want to help and, want to give life and whatnot. The truth, though, is if you look at the long 2,000-year history of Christianity, there's a lot of death dealing going on. And so the paradox here is that too oftentimes well-meaning people are the ones who end up, maybe not killing themselves, but endorsing killing, being part of it, helping the problems continue, all while meaning well, and that's the real problem. And so in that process, what I'm saying ultimately is religion turns from a religion of life to a religion of death. And I think this is one of the big problems of Christianity, that too often it has become a religion of death. I think this is what we see in the United States, where I'm located now, but there's an old history in Europe there where you now are working, and in so many other places around the world where Christianity continues to put itself on the wrong side.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of this current moment, like, what are some questions that are being asked in the public square that you think a life-giving for all faith are not just going to listen to, but take a very specific stand on?
Let me start in the U.S. because that's where a lot of this was written. But I keep in mind, I always write with a global presence also, because I spend a lot of time outside the country also. But if you think about the U.S. specifically, you could really start with Black Lives Matter. This whole notion that there are Black people being killed in broad daylight, in public, in situations where you wouldn't believe this would even be possible. And that, I think, is one of these big questions that in the U.S., of course, more and more people are waking up to that, which is wonderful. You have big protests, you have big marches, which need to happen, which need to be sustained. But if you look at what's happening there, some of it is very blatant. Some of it, therefore, also, makes people outraged in response. But a lot of it is not even being seen. If you think about the Black community, the oppression of African Americans in the U.S. Certainly has to do with police violence. But the everyday questions, how do you make a living? How do you make ends meet? Those questions are not as much addressed, and you could say you have more people die, not just from lack of economic support, but from lack of healthcare, people dying behind closed doors that we wouldn't ever even know. You have all these things going on at the same time. And some of it is in the public mind. Some of it is where we need to start. But if you look at the huge situation now, I think in the U.S. we really have a culture of death that is almost unparalleled all the way back to slavery because of all these things happening at the same time, people's livelihoods being taken away. Then, of course, we have the pandemic crisis. In a pandemic, you could say that's an act of nature. But what's really so telling is the response, where in the U.S., the response is just so much worse than anywhere else on the planet. I mean, this is the crazy thing, right? It's not just, it's really, really bad. No, there's no other place, as far as I can tell, that's as in bad a shape. And I think it's all connected. So this is not just, one dang thing after another, but it all hangs together, and we have to ask where is it connected? What are these relations?
No, one of the things about the election taking place and is that each time it comes up, you have a number of political engagement or like types of political engagement from people of faith get trotted out, and I think that this time the number of people who do the whole "we got to keep religion and politics separate" routine are feeling more awkward, right? Like at this moment, the consequences over the type of leadership you have, even if the options aren't necessarily wonderful, it's very clear that if you want to reduce harm to the lives of many in the country, and especially the least of these and the planet, then you aren't going to continue supporting Donald Trump. And I think one of the defense mechanisms of this, empire supporting religion is that myth of private religion, right? Like, where do you think that originated historically, and how did it become such a I don't know, so popular in a religion that you emphasize in the book has a guy who's killed by the state at the very heart of it?
That's a really important question. I mean, first of all, let's be very clear that this idea of private religion is not a normal sort of way of looking at religion, right? I mean, if you go back through the centuries, through the ages, religion has always been a public thing. I mean, for Jesus himself, for Paul, they would have been surprised that you could make religion a private thing. It wasn't even their idea. This was not in their world. Religion was tied to everything else, and to all the other powers. And you had to make your decisions, which powers do you want to serve? That's very clear in Jesus. And even in Paul, when he talks about principalities and powers, there's a difference between the principalities and powers and Jesus, and religion relates to it also. So that's sort of where we're coming from. These are our roots. The fact that this is different, you asked about the history. For theologians, very quickly, people go to the history of ideas and they say, well, the Enlightenment, blah, 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 right? This is sort of the common thing, and then you have some thinkers that look at religion as a private thing. You have the German Enlightenment philosophers, you have some British ones, it moves to the US, and so on and so forth. But for me, the question is more like, why is it that these ideas have some credibility in the first place? I mean, just because some Mr. Locke or Mr. Kant or somebody would say it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's therefore the way it should be. I think this is sort of the interest of the powers that be, the dominant powers. Especially if religion throws a wrench into the machine, if it is pushing something that doesn't match the dominant status quo, then religion, of course, has to be pushed aside, has to be pushed into private, cannot make too much trouble. And so the powers then can, run their own course, do what they want to do. If religion therefore is sort of sidelined, and so I think this is one of the reasons, for reasons of big money, big political power, that religion had to be silenced. And if it couldn't be silenced, of course, it was brought along big time. You see this even in the U.S. We have this religion and state separation, but at the same time, religion is oftentimes, especially in the past, decades, more and more in the White House. God bless America and whatnot. So then here's the problem. On the one hand, religion has been sidelined, and on the other hand, it's been co-opted by the dominant powers. And what we're losing is religion as a credible alternative. So the problem here is not just that religion has been privatized, but whenever it has been politicized, it has been done so in the dominant status quo. And that's true even for these evangelicals who, decades ago were all about, keep religion private. And now they're all in the White House and all around the powers that be. Whereas what we need to talk about, you and I, and hopefully all your listeners, is how can religion in this situation actually be a credible alternative? And what can we do to shift this thing in a different direction?
Mm-hmm. And in the book, one of the ways you put that challenge is that, in a sense, Christians need to actually be atheists about rival deities, right? And all the imperial adjacent ones. And I think that is a really important task to get, right? Because if you think of a lot of questions around atheism or this battle, this intellectual battle with whether or not you're going to assert there's some ultimate reality or not, and that is a very safe conversation to have. Whatever side you end up on in a battle between a theist and an atheist in the abstract possibilities of ultimate reality doesn't change the material order any. And you go in the book, I think, do a great job pointing out how that's the perfect conversation for empire religion to get you hung up on.
It really is, Pip. Yeah, thanks for putting that out there. I mean, it may come as a shock to have me say, at the heart of Christianity is something that you might consider as atheism. And atheism here, the way I describe it, is not to say it's the rejection of all gods, but it is the rejection of theisms. And theisms, the way not only I define it, but one obvious way to define it is the worship of the gods of the dominant status quo. You have this in the history of ideas. Theism oftentimes means, the gods of the system. Roman theism is really the worship of the dominant Roman gods, right? And then there's a Christian theism where, God very much looks like all the other rulers. So at one point, God then looked like a king sitting on a throne with all the royal insignia. Today, you may have God looking more like a CEO, or perhaps, God beware Donald Trump, something like that. That's what people think God is. And then theism is whatever the dominant system puts out there, and people feel they have to believe it. And so the atheism here is really a rejection of this kind of theism. So this is actually not just a crazy idea of mine. It goes back to the early Christian history, because the early Christians, there were some Roman philosophers that considered, and they called Christians atheists. They called, Christianity, young Christianity, to be a religion of atheism. And that may surprise you, because you think, well, they could read, right? They would know that the Christians were talking about God. So why were they called atheists? Well, turns out these Romans understood very well that theism means the dominant gods. And Jesus in no way resembled a dominant god. He was somebody who was actually killed by the dominant empire and the dominant gods. He was somebody who was not at the top of the world. He was somebody whose power was very different from dominant top-down power. And keep in mind, the Romans were not narrowly, religious in the sense of rejecting other religions. They were interreligious. They were happy to integrate other religions in their pantheon. They had, not only the old Roman gods, but the Greek gods, the Egyptian gods, Isis and Osiris. They were all recognized as, valid theisms, and Christianity wasn't. So what I'm saying is these early Christians, maybe they could have taken this as a badge of honor to say the Romans know we're different. Now, that could be dangerous, but on the other hand, that may be the only way to have a real alternative in the midst of an empire. So here is something really life-giving, namely the worship of a God who does not resemble dominant theism, who is alive, who is active, who is subversive, who organizes people in a different way. And that's why I'm so excited about this kind of atheism. The other kind of atheism that you also mentioned in your question, you have these big debates, of people that don't want to believe anything, that are just cynical about religion. It turns out there's a sort of theism that supports the status quo. There's a sort of atheism that just as much supports the status quo as well, and then dominant neoliberal capitalism and all of its shenanigans is home free. That's of course the other option. And I think the early Christians showed us a different way of doing things.
And I think underneath that is this need to recognize that religion for the ancient world, functioned as the narrative that shaped the marketplace. It shaped politics and these type of things. And you lay out the way in which Caesar was not just a political leader, but functioned as a religious symbol and this type of thing. In order to understand why calling Christians atheists was revelatory, it requires one to see that the Christians were opting out of the basic agreement for that domination system civic order. And their allegiance to Christ problematizes their allegiance to Caesar. And I think that it's hard for a lot of Christians who are figuring out faith in a post-Christendom context to get over that anxiety of losing culture dominance. But I think with your framing, it can actually be invigorating, because we might come to more closely hold to that task we've had from in our basic DNA of embodying an alternative politic and an alternative community.
That's right. It's a way of reclaiming what Christianity has certainly done early on, and I would say it's been going on through the centuries, oftentimes unrecognized. It just didn't get the press that dominant Christianity always got, all the way to this moment in the world where Christianity so much looks like it is on the side of the dominant and the conservative status quo. Well, there is always been alternatives. And what's so fascinating about this, the way you put it just now, Trip, the early Christians, in a way, this was a protest movement. This was a way of refusing the dominant status quo. Not the way we think of a protest movement now, people going out with bullhorns and, walking the streets with posters. But certainly in a way that worried the Roman Empire, and they knew there was something dangerous about it, even though this was a small group. This wasn't a very large movement necessarily in the beginning, but it was so different that it challenged something. And I need to add something to that. It wasn't just protesting. This is what a lot of my students at Vanderbilt are thinking. When they think about protest movement, they think of we protest the system, we criticize, we point out what's wrong. The other part is just as important. It was also building an alternative. So it wasn't just saying you're wrong, and we wish things were different, anti this and anti that, but it was also pro some real life alternative. This is the beginning of some, maybe let's call it socialist relationships, right? This is the beginning, not just of an alternative politics. I mean, politics is important, don't get me wrong, but it's really the beginning of an alternative economics as well. By the way, this is the work that we're trying to do here at Vanderbilt with this new Wendland-Cook program in religion and justice, where, one thing I kept saying to our students is, if you speak truth to power, that's really important. But keep in mind, when you speak truth to power, at the end of the day, it's possible that you have the truth and the other side still has the power. So in addition to speaking truth to power, we're not abandoning that. We continue that time-honored tradition. In addition to that, we also need to be building. And here, I think politics, as I keep saying, is important, but we really need to think about the economic ways of building and rebuilding people's lives so that everybody can flourish.
Yeah. And I think in the book you use the question posed to Jesus about taxation, about rendering to Caesar what's Caesar and God's what's God's, as a real helpful way, or bringing to the surface the way allegiance to the status quo is latent in just the way we even hear texts like that.
I mean, that little text there, of course, that's quoted a lot by those people that want to see faith as a private thing, that say, give Caesar what is Caesar's, that means, well, what does it really mean, right? People very quickly assume this means politics, economics, the world, and give God what is God's. That means religion, what happens inside your little church or your big church on Sunday morning, what happens above the sky somewhere. And that's, of course, a complete misreading, for Jesus's own time and for Jesus's own theology, which sort of course, is grounded and deeply rooted in Judaism. You go back to the beginning of the Bible, and God creates heaven and earth. That's the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. That's the beginning of the Christian Bible. God creates heaven and earth. You have this in the Quran. So Muslims are really in this same conversation here. Where what belongs to God? Somebody at the time of Jesus, if you were in theology class and Jesus would have asked you what belongs to God, if you would have said religion, you would have failed the class. If you would have said Methodism, I happen to be a Methodist, yeah, sure, but let's talk about what really matters, right? What belongs to God is everything. Period. Nothing does not belong to God, and what belongs to Caesar? What's left after everything, right? So this is some really smart teaching. It shows you, how not only did Jesus have a sense of humor, he had a sense of making a point. And today, with all of our modern presuppositions, we miss it. But that is really, and we're not talking about, you have to confuse religion and politics and whatnot, but you really have to think about how these things are related and what's the impact of it. There's no way around it, even though you want to keep things distinct and you want to have conversations about, what the differences might be.
Well, one of the things that you've done throughout your work is try to bring the insights from different liberation theologies to the church in America that has to, one, learn how to listen to them, and then what fidelity and faithfulness looks like when you're much closer to Zacchaeus or Matthew the tax collector in the biblical narrative than the overwhelming majority of people who get the attention of Jesus, right? Is its own task. So how would you kind of introduce what it's like to listen and maybe unlearn with the help of liberation theologies the types of questions or discourses in the church that are problematic and need to be challenged.
Let me go back to something we said a moment ago, and that is that, even if religion wants to pretend that it is separate, that it is private, that it is merely personal, that is not the truth. It is always part of everything, and everything is always part of it. And so the first step here, I think, especially for dominant mainline Christians, is to understand how everything is already part of this religion and how it doesn't develop separately. That was the big lesson that was learned in Germany during the Third Reich, namely that these churches that wanted to keep on the sidelines, and this is actually true for my own Methodist church in Germany, they basically made this decision: we're not going to support Hitler, we're not going to go along with the status quo, but they also didn't do anything to push back against it. And so once it was all over, the question became, have we been part of the problem by not addressing it? So that's the first thing, and what the liberation theologians and theologies in plural have done is really help people see these connections. and that happened, interestingly enough, in various ways. You had the question of race, you had the question of gender. Of course, we still have all these questions. You have the questions of sexuality, and you have the questions of economics. Poverty, the way it's sometimes described, or I would say maybe the questions of working people, labor, those things. Once you became aware how everything belonged together, had to be addressed. And the first insight here is not only about liberation, it's really about how we are beholden to the system all along. And once you start digging in there, once you start digging in there, the real interesting insight becomes we're beholden to the system in so many ways, especially at the places that we're not used to addressing. So the church is waking up, I think, at this point with regards to matters of racism, which is high time. I really think we need to do a lot more. The church has been waking up for a bit, on questions of gender and sexuality. But I think the church is still firmly asleep on matters of economics, unless, perhaps you talk about dire poverty somewhere else. But if you think about economics also shaping us all the way to the core, and ultimately building up all this political power. The fact that we have this messy political system, it's not just because we have messy politicians, but because somebody's paying for it. Somebody's keeping these things in place. Somebody has an interest in that. Those are some of the big questions that need to be raised today. And keep in mind, Tripp, when we say liberation theologies, they are always indigenous in the sense that they emerge out of a given time and place. So they're not things that fall from the sky, but that come out of very specific struggles. And here's something that's very little known, and I think your readers should know, that even the term liberation theology was coined independently of each other in different places without the people that use the term knowing of each other. The three basic ones, two of them are very well known, the other one isn't. The first one is Gustavo Gutierrez in Latin America. They talked about Teología de la Liberación in Spanish. And Gustavo came up with this term in a very specific struggle that had to do with, economic oppression in Latin America. James Cone, at the same time writing, when he wrote his book, Theology of Liberation, came up with this term in the liberation struggle of, the civil rights era and, the Black Panthers and African-American liberation in the U.S., not knowing that Gutierrez had used this term. And there was a third that's mostly forgotten today, which is Frederick Herzog, who was one of my teachers, a white male liberation theologian. People didn't even know these existed in the South, also writing out of the civil rights struggle. And he was the first one to publish an article by the title Liberation Theology, a few months before Cone published his book by that title. And so those three, at least, I know were writing about liberation theology, not even knowing that this was a term just yet.
Mm-hmm. And underneath one of the things they all share in common is the recognition that God, as testified to in Scripture, takes sides. And I think that just has to be captured. And a lot of times, Christianity in dominant culture wants God to be like ubiquitously on everybody's side all the time with a bucket full of affirmation. And liberation theologies, in the way that they articulate divine solidarity with those on the underside of history, then kind of beg the question for people of privilege and power, like, do you want to go where God is or not? And I think that you've posed that question in different ways in your work, but like when that question is heard in a time like this, what does that look like? Like, where do you go in a moment like this if you want to practice solidarity with the least of these and those on the underside?
Exactly. I think that is the fundamental question. And thanks for bringing the conversation back to the question of God, because ultimately, liberation theology, people think, it's about ethics. People think it's about analyzing, a dominant system. But at the very beginning and at the very end, it is about God. It is about who is God, what is God doing, and how do we become part of that? How do we actually join what's going on the right side, not just of history, but really on the right side of what God is doing. I oftentimes, and this is part of this Jesus versus Caesar book also, I rephrase the question for my students from WWJD, what would Jesus do, to something like, what is Jesus doing, WIJD or something like that. Because, for Christians who somehow believe that God is real and that Jesus is real, the question is not just, what might happen, but what is really going on and where is God at work? That was the key question, of course, not just in liberation theology, but in so many ways throughout history, was the key question that kept a Bonhoeffer, alive, and in the end, it got him killed. But it kept him doing what he was doing, and it kept him making a difference. So this is the central question: what is God doing? And once you sort of start asking that, you really need to be specific. One thing that does not work anymore is this idea of a sky god who sits up on a throne, looking down on us, staying neutral, loving everybody equally. And even, if you wanted to talk about God's love, I know this is a big conversation, you'd really have to say, even if you wanted to say that God loves everybody, you'd have to be very clear that this love looks different in different situations, right? I mean, if you're a parent and one of your kids beats up the other of your kids, you may love them all the same, but you may step in and break up the fight and punish the one who beats up the other one, especially if one gets hurt or something like that. That might be called tough love, but that's certainly taking sides. That's not staying neutral and doing some sappy theological reflection on the margins. You have to get involved. But let me say a bit more about this God thing, because this is where it gets really interesting. So it logically is like you have two options, right? One is God takes sides. The other one is God doesn't take sides. The worst empire theology, and this is the one we have right now in the United States, the worst empire theology says God takes the side of the status quo. That's why it is in power. God is taking the side of Donald Trump. That's why he is the president. That's the worst theology I can imagine. I'm sorry. This is a knee-jerk theology that's actually very old, that goes back to some of the founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, talked about the U.S. empire rising because God wanted it that way. That's God taking sides. if that's your theology, a theology that claims God's neutrality is an improvement. Keep that in mind, to say, well, God's not on the side of Donald Trump, God's on the side of everybody. Well, that's already better. But in reality, that neutrality theology still supports the status quo, because the status quo usually is the one that messes up everybody else, right? That's the one that has the power. That's the one that has, a lot of the privileges that we need to be worried about. So the third option then is to talk about God taking sides, the side of the victims, the side of those who are trampled underfoot by the empire, very specifically. And now you could say, well, that's sort of an ideological reading. But now you go back to our traditional texts, go back to our scriptural texts. And for the most part, maybe not everywhere, but in so many places, God takes actually the sides of the victims, those on the margins. Look at the Jesus movement, look at the Hebrew prophets, look all the way back to the Exodus, from Egypt, look at the Babylonian exile, look at the book of Revelation. You name it, God takes sides. And that's the liberative position. And of course, that's why we have hope, because we think this is where liberation actually happens.
Yeah. And the, like when you imagine, either limiting the sphere of religion to the private, or like God, doesn't take sides, just doesn't even play favorites. Like all those, like when you limit where your religious valuation of life narrows to the individual, then the economic valuation of all those things seeps in. The market valuation of all those things. When you refuse to think theologically about all the ways you're connected to the life of this planet and your neighbor, then the logic of neoliberal capitalism seeps in. And I think that, part of the tension or regular resistance I'll get in talking about this with people is that we can't really imagine a world not structured on capitalism. And so, you bring up in the book that, Christians can come up with all sorts of different ways of reading Revelation and thinking about the end of the world. But what could the global body of Christ do to structure the globe economically different? No thoughts. We just get silent. How do you... how would you diagnose that problem? Like, where does it come from that our imaginations are so small? And are there ways that the church today can begin to move against it or to open things up?
Yeah, that's, I think, maybe the key problem here, that our imaginations are so small. And sometimes I think maybe they're so small because we limit them to the walls of the church. We limit them to some people that meet on Sunday mornings, or, maybe some house circle, house church or Bible study or something like that. And we think this is sort of the limit of the gospel. But what I've learned, you start reading, reading the Bible, you could read the traditions, anything, but you start reading these things literally on the streets. This is what the Jesus movement was doing. It was rereading the ancient traditions it had on the streets with the people, and something changes right there. For me, some of the most powerful places to read the Bible in my own life have been in union halls. And labor unions organizing working people, broadly conceived. That's not even a conversation that's happening in most churches right now, certainly not in the US or in Europe for that matter. But reading, our texts in that world really broadens your horizons right there, because you'd have to ask the question, what difference does Jesus make there? What difference does Jesus make in our everyday lives? Work is the place where we spend the bulk of our waking hours. So this is a good place to really pay attention to everything. By the way, work is the place I would recommend to pay more attention to racism and sexism, because this is where it hits home a lot. where it all comes together as the place of intersectionality. And so imagination here for me is not just something we have to develop in a retreat or in a theology classroom or by reading a text, but by reading any text in the midst of real life, I think is where this happens, and where the real perspective comes back in. Unfortunately, we're not doing that enough, and if we're doing it, we're only doing it in very small experiments. Oftentimes artificial experiments, places the church might go to, a soup kitchen perhaps, but then it serves soup instead of really sharing experiences and sitting down with those who are being served, and talking about the Bible with those who might be able to tell you something about your neoliberal capitalism if you were only willing to listen.
Mm-hmm. So, like when you listen, what does it sound like? Because one of the challenges, I think, is as a culture, a lot of us are scared of doing worse than we are and imagine that we're doing better than we are. And, one of the elements that I really liked about the Occupy movement was the rhetoric of the 1%. But if you've been thinking about in lockdown, just the amount of money Jeff Bezos made, like, he could have given $100,000 raise to every Amazon employee and he would not have lost money. That's crazy, right? Like the world that we're in, I think when we start to ask questions of justice, we don't even have a scale that is natural to us to understand the level of affluence at the very top.
That is true. And the funny thing is at that level, answering your question, something comes in that the church or theology, including a lot of liberation theology, has not done in a very long time. And that's called class analysis. That sounds like an ominous term, oh my God, what is class analysis? But it's simply analyzing who is winning and who is losing in a specific economic system. Now, in the US, for instance, we're pretty clear about who is not winning. I mean, the number of unemployed is sky high. And people who are dropping out of the labor market and all of that. Children in poverty, the real kicker that a lot of people around the world and even in the US don't know is that child poverty in the US is sky high. In places I used to work in Dallas for many years, we had child poverty of 38, 39%. The average is still around a third of children in the US live under the poverty line. So your question, once you start reading these things in real life, that's stuff you have to pay attention to. People are really sort of at their wits' end, and survival is at stake in a country like the United States. That's one of the richest countries in the world. But once you start there, you really see how a lot of other people are screwed as well. And that includes people in the middle class who, may not have a problem feeding their children or, making ends meet for now. But there is no way forward for them, to guarantee that their children are going to be fine, when they leave school or graduate from school. There is no way to guarantee that their health will be fine, if something happens to them and they lose their health care, of course, so many Americans don't even have health care, which is unimaginable in so many other places around the world. So it's those little things. But now we're still talking about money and wealth. Let's talk about power here. The class analysis question is not just about who has how much money, but who actually has any chance to change the world, to transform the world. And this is, of course, where most middle-class people fool themselves. This is really true for academics and perhaps also for pastors. We think, we have all this privilege and all this power to change the world. And if I write another book like Jesus versus Caesar, the world is going to be a better place. None of this ever really happens because we don't have the power. Unless, of course, we become aware of the fact that we don't have the power and then we organize. So the beauty here is this. Even the middle class needs to realize that it is not the ruling class. And once it realizes that, then you can move forward differently. Then you can start organizing. Then you can bring people together, the 99%, as it were. I often say this is the working majority, because these are people that have to work for a living. The 1% may work too, but they don't have to. It's not just a matter of what you have and your wealth, but how much power you have. Do you actually have this power? Probably don't. So you need to rethink what to do about that.
In the book, you talk about how religions call out a form of life, a kind of devotion, and such. When Christianity takes seriously the contrast at the heart of it between life giving and death dealing religion, what does devotion look like? Because it's not going to be an escapist type of devotion or an escapist form of life or a denial one. What does a life-giving form of devotion look like?
So the real question is, what do you devote yourself to? Or, even bigger, what do you devote your life to? And that's not just what's in your head. This is sort of how your whole life is organized. What are you really serving here? And my worry is that, we're ultimately devoting ourselves to mammon, serving mammon without ever knowing it. So this is, of course, the famous saying, right, where Jesus reminds his listeners, you cannot serve God and mammon. You have to make a choice. The problem I see is that we have already made this choice to serve mammon, oftentimes thinking mammon is God or God is mammon, confusing the two. You can see this, you can test yourself. Something that you said earlier, Tripp, was we cannot even imagine neoliberal capitalism to end or to go away. If this is true, and I think it is, I've sometimes said Christians find it easier for the world to go away than to believe the world will end, than that neoliberal capitalism will end. And if that's the case, then you have put neoliberal capitalism and money and all of that, Jeff Bezos, all of these people, in the place of God. If you think there is nothing that can be done about it, you've basically accepted it. You have devoted your life to it. So devotion, what would devotion look like? It would have to start with realizing what your options are. And if you realize I've devoted my life to the wrong thing, then you can shift, and then you can think about what devotion would look like in the other direction. But devotion now is not neutral. It's not something that happens when you go up on the mountaintop or when you, observe a beautiful sunrise. Devotion has to happen in the context of everyday life and the flow of power. You have to identify devotion to the dominant power. You have to stop it. And then you have to devote yourself, not to nothing, but to alternative power. This is part of the beauty of it. So when Jesus critiques the power of Rome, the power of dominant religion, including his own dominant religion, right? He's not pointing fingers so much just as the others, but at his own world. When Jesus does that, at the same time, he devotes himself very clearly to an alternative power. So it's not about rejecting power, but finding a different power, and becoming part of that. Discipleship then means, becoming part of that other power. And maybe a more contemporary word here would be organizing power. That's part of devotion. You organize a different power. You become part of it. You think about, how your mind is driven by one, could be driven by the other, how your heart is shaped by that, how your actions are shaped by that, how your will is shaped by that. And all of it goes together. And then you could talk about what might be good practices. I am ordained clergy. I sometimes wear a clerical collar, but I really made it a rule for myself only to wear the clerical collar in the streets when I'm out there. When I'm in the church or in the classroom, I don't need it. But that devotion really happens when I am proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God out there in the streets. And by in the streets, of course, I mean, maybe a protest march, maybe a picket line, maybe, working together with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, which is a new co-op development center here in Nashville that's doing good work. That's where devotion happens, as far as I'm concerned.
By the time a Christian comes of age and starts to internalize in a sense, the call of discipleship in our time, a lot of them are already stuck with debt that ties them to the system. If you think of as in the classroom, how many students go to divinity school or studying in college, and at the very same time, they're realizing that the gospel, they could be more biblical than the family that showed them Jesus. And that the gospel actually has something to say about the major crises facing the world and all this type of stuff. And then by the time they get done doing that, they have student loans. And so then they're in this type of debt slavery when it goes to vocation. And that's becoming more and more prevalent. Even ministers graduating with debt. And so where do you think they're going to use their gifts? In the churches that can afford to help them pay it off. So I sometimes getting clear on the contrast and things doesn't mean it's immediately easy to figure out what to do. And part of the task is figuring out how we organize as a church so that people aren't vocationally stilted away from having their passion and gifts connect with God's radical moves for justice.
I agree, and I think this is why economics is so important, because it really ties us down and it holds us back. So student debt, I think, is a great example, and this is something that we're still trying to figure out, and we haven't, but it is something that keeps students from actually speaking the truth about these things. And if you think about how that then, like you just said, translates into the churches, it's really scary, because you now have produced ministers and pastors who are already changed to the system in a way that is really very problematic. And then, of course, it's very clear who is actually telling them or preventing them from saying certain things on the pulpit, in the pulpit, or in their Bible studies. And it's going even deeper. It's not just what they say; it's even what they dare to think. And so we have in this country, in the U.S., this separation of church and state. But we don't have any separation of church and economy. And so the economy, in so many ways, hits home completely in our education system, in the way we do religion, in the way we do church. It's invisible. And so back to this devotion question, you really have to become aware of how you're devoting your life to these principalities and powers that you do not see, but that you're afraid of every moment of your existence. And once you start not just criticizing that, but building alternatives, I think you could really move forward. But it's ultimately not just about preaching and criticizing and pointing out the truth. It is about building alternatives. And that is one of the big projects I think that the church yet has to think more about. That's what we're trying to do and help people with this Wendland-Cook program and religion and justice I keep mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we wrap up, maybe you can share a bit about that program. I mean, people have listened to the podcast, or if this is your first time listening to Joerg, just go listen to the other episodes. But you moved up to Nashville from Texas, and then you launched this new program, and they can see these issues, are part of your vocation. So how would you introduce the program's mission, and what are you most excited about that's on the horizon?
So the basic mission, it's called the Wendland-Cook program in religion and justice. And you can check it out on the website is simple, religionandjustice.org. So one word, religionandjustice.org. The focus for us is really on economic and ecological justice. And that is not to say that other forms of justice are not of concern to us. We're really very much interested intersectionally, in what happens in questions of race and gender, sexuality as well. But we're focusing on economics and ecology because Those are some things that in our view are oftentimes neglected, especially by religious communities. Now, ecology, of course, is more, I think, in people's minds than the economy. And by economy, we're really talking about labor issues. That is to say, we're not just talking about what happens on Wall Street and what do the big economists think. We want to know what is happening in the lives of working people, everyday working people, the 99% that have to work for a living. And the interesting question is what's happening there is what's happening everywhere else. So if you look at ecology, what is it that exploits people is what exploits the ecology, the environment. What is it that extracts resources, from the ground of the earth is ultimately what extracts, labor from people. So there's close parallels. This is why ecology is part of what we're doing, because it is related to, this extractive and exploitative system in which we find ourselves. And of course, we find that this system also exploits our religious and cultural resources. This is what worries me most as a theologian, that we have so harnessed Christianity and various other religions to this system that we can't even do our work anymore. So as we recognize that, we now try to figure out how do we build alternatives. And the way we're doing it, people go into our website, they might find various webinars, interview series, blog series. We're trying to figure out how do working people actually build power. Some of that happens in the labor movement. This is sort of an old time-honored tradition. And about 100 years ago, it was very common in the United States for church and labor to work together. That's not the case anymore, but there's lots of history and lots of interesting developments there. But that's only one example. The other example, one that we're really excited about, is this cooperative development I mentioned a moment ago, because worker co-ops especially are places where working people are taking things into their own hands, where they basically, not only work for somebody else, but where they're taking into their own hands their own freedom to work, their decisions about, what gets done, and also who gets the profit. So this is a democratic way of relating together that we believe has an enormous impact on democratic ways for being in politics. So we call this economic democracy, which we believe needs to have an impact on political democracy. And in fact, we would say if you don't have economic democracy, your political democracy is going to be in trouble, which it is right now. We see that.
Yeah.
And you take that into the church, you say, well, how could we have religious democracy? Well, maybe you follow the lead of what worker cooperatives are doing. And all of a sudden, the church would no longer be as beholden to money and individual big donors and some people who want to call the shots just because, they have always called the shots everywhere else, right? In politics and economics and so on. So it's really about producing a very different culture. And one of the projects that we're engaged in is really sort of bringing cooperatives and churches together. If you go to our website, there's a blog this month, October, where we have this conversation with co-op developers, researchers. What do religion and cooperative work do have in common? What could they learn from each other? Those are a couple of examples. But once you bring all that together, we are saying it's going to revitalize faith. It's going to revitalize people's not only lives, but people's agencies, people's minds, people's hearts, communities, you name it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and catching up and everything.
And thanks for having me, Trip. It's always great to be in conversation. And the work that you're doing, I've always thought is part of this whole deliberative process. The beauty of it all, let me maybe conclude with this comment. That's what I learned sort of over all these years. The beauty is that the liberation we're talking about is not self-made, or it's not sort of a few people that are, dreamers and have their heads stuck in the clouds. It's God's liberation that's always moving, and that's moving around us even now. that we have to find, that we can devote ourselves to, that we can link to. And so it's bigger than us. And as it happens, it cannot be stopped.
Awesome.